Hi, my name is Jacques van Zyl. I'm here to talk to you about competitive strategy at MBA level. Now, competitive strategy or corporate strategy, as it's also referred to, is a specific area in managerial science that specifically looks at how companies position themselves in a market, the plans and the strategies that they devise to gain competitive edge, to maintain that edge, and in fact to also increase that edge. So in your course, I will be talking across the span of 7 videos, referring to specific models of strategy, also referring to how one can devise a particular strategy, why that strategy would be applicable for that particular business in that particular sector. We'll also have a look at how do we implement that strategy, of course, and the monitoring of that strategy, and then eventually measuring the strategy, whether that strategy has worked or not. I would advise you to read a lot of cases, a lot of stories about business strategy, corporate strategy, competitive strategy, because at this particular level, it is most probably more about strategic thinking and the way that we apply our minds by using the existing models and structures and prescripts that we know exist out there in terms of this particular field in the science. So you should become quite adept at applying the models that we'll be talking about to various cases. There are many cases available on the web. If you Google them, you will find them. The idea for you is to become a strategic thinker in that particular respect. So, this particular video will be about an introduction to competitive strategy. What exactly is it that we mean when we talk about strategy? We'll be looking at issues such as, for example, can a strategy emerge as the business develops? Are these strategies perhaps more prescriptive, so that businesses have to follow a particular line of thinking? Now, it brings to mind the case of Boeing versus Airbus. Just as an introduction, Airbus, as many of you might know, have the A380 in operation right now, the world over. Large machine, takes 555 passengers, flies hub to hub. It's got a wingspan, I believe, 55 meters longer than the largest Boeing. Now, Boeing has brought into the skies, I wanted to say on board, but let's rather say into the skies, their Boeing Dreamliner, which takes 250 passengers and flies between smaller airports. Now, just imagine yourselves operating in an industry where you produce these aircraft at a cost of $8 million, $13 million per unit, where you're looking at a world economy that is a little bit depressed right now, where you're looking at an order book of some of these airliners who are already, or airlines who are already almost in liquidation, and you think about the risks involved in producing those aircraft, the input costs, the capital that has to be sunk in. And then you just reverse yourself a little bit back from that, and you think about how the strategist might, or strategists at the company, thought about this, because it's way two different strategies, isn't that so? The one larger aircraft needs larger airports. The one smaller one, much fewer passengers. So if you look at that and you think about how were they thinking, obviously thinking completely differently. And that is operating in an industry where often the net profit runs between 2 to 5% on multi-billion-dollar capital investments and cash flow investments. So if you just look at that particular story, and both these companies have survived for many, many years and will still survive for many, many years. So as I said in the beginning, it's all about the thinking. What were they thinking? Why did they make those decisions? And hopefully across the span of the next couple of videos that you will be watching on this particular topic, you might develop knowledge yourself in that respect as well. I just want to focus for the next couple of seconds on two distinctly different terminologies, yet they interlink. You would often hear that people don't talk about competitive strategy, but they talk about strategic management. Now, if you take that particular terminology, strategic management, it clearly focuses on the way that we manage strategy, which would, of course, include specific plans when we execute these, monitoring of those plans, applying the resources to those plans, and then eventually measuring the effectiveness of those plans. So where does competition then fit in and competitive strategy? Well, fact is that all of us would want to have a company that specifically has a niche product or services and where the levels of competition are quite low. We might even say that a monopoly would do us fine because then we've got no competitors. But that's not the way it works in industry out there and in the economy, because as we know, competition is what really drives an economy. So there will always be competitors, whether they're small, whether they're big. And it's how the company responds to those competitive forces that creates competitive strategy. Because competitive strategy could, for example, be defensive. If I, for example, operate in a sector where there are some large established players, I don't want to make too much noise. So I'm rather going to defend my position, keep my small market share, but perhaps deliver service and product of extremely high quality. Now, I might be a bigger player in that market, and then my competitive strategy would be to be aggressive, more verbal, more visible in terms of, for example, my advertising campaign, be more aggressive. So it'll depend on my position in the market, but whatever strategy I follow, eventually I need to manage that strategy, and this is where strategic management specifically fits in. You often hear people talk, or in literature, books that you pick up, that the term corporate strategy is mentioned. Now, there are distinctly three levels of strategy development and strategy implementation. The first one is the corporate level, of course, where the board of directors and the executives mainly will get together and thrash out a strategy for the organization, which will be built on their values, vision, and mission, which are concepts that we'll have a look at in a later video. And then, of course, they pass those plans down to senior managers at the business level. And depending how that business is structured, whether it is severely hierarchical, whether it's more an organic business, a national business perhaps, these strategies have to be broken down into business plans specifically. And then, of course, from there it cascades down to the operational level, which is the third level of strategy implementation. And I deliberately say at that level, not strategy formulation, because mostly strategy formulation is a top-down exercise, although a lot of companies do a bottom-up as well. So one could say even at the operational level, to some level, operational supervisors, line managers might strategize or re-strategize, that with senior managers, and then operationalize the strategy. For individuals in the organization, preferably, the top strategy or corporate strategies should find expression in their KPIs, their performance management pro formas, where they work towards measurables, because in the final analysis, when we measure strategy or the effectiveness thereof, that'll be a bottoms-up reporting, which will eventually find expression in financial statements. That would be the final measure, I guess, of whether the strategy worked or not. So in this introduction to competitive strategy, of course, one needs to say that no strategy can develop or exist without a thorough analysis of the environment of the organization, the competition, the customers, the larger environment. And that is what some of the videos that will follow will focus on, because often companies make the mistake of devising a strategy simply based on a nice idea or a good idea. Nowadays, however, most of your large corporates will gather an amazing amount of market intelligence, which they will try to quantify, put into models that can help them project, for example, within certain economic conditions, the performance of the organization going forward. So in terms of competitive strategy, the analysis forms a serious part of what eventually then gets devised and what gets implemented. The advantages, of course, of competitive strategy, they are numerous. I mean, for one, a lot of companies simply have to survive. So them having a good strategy will assist them in that. Some companies need to grow. And of course, for them, that particular strategic focus of possibly acquiring their supply chain or their retailers would be a strategy that will ensure them not just competitive advantage, but growth as well. Then, of course, without any good strategy, the organization as a ship will, of course, be rudderless. So it will most probably, without a strategy, be very vulnerable to external forces, possibly larger companies that are on the predatory strategy approach, wanting to acquire them, cut them up, sell them. All those strategies could then affect the longevity, the sustainability of the business. So from that particular point, and again, looking at the board of directors who, from a corporate governance point of view, are in the final analysis accountable for whether the organization is sustainable or not, it is seriously important that the company does have, or the organization does have, strategic intent. Finally, in this video, I'd just like to talk a little bit about prescriptive theories, as they are called in terms of competitive strategy, and then also emergent theories. And I'm just going to touch on one or two of both. Of course, larger organizations specifically have to be very sensitive and take cognizance of the behavior of their competitors because of their size. So mostly from a prescriptive theory or strategy point of view, these organizations would have very clear, definite, proactive strategies by which they will ensure their competitive advantage. For example, they would look at developing internal resources and maximizing that in terms of advantage. Some of them might purely go for a profit maximization strategy, which would ensure their competitive advantage. And in that, for example, cost accounting, cost control becomes imperative, but that would be prescriptive, and that's exactly what it says. If you look at emergent theories of strategy development, you might more find those strategies in situations, economic conditions where there's not a lot of security, where conditions are fluctuating maybe on a monthly basis. So where companies then have to adjust as they go along, as they operate in business. They need to make sure that the strategy that they then adopt will ensure their longevity and their sustainability. So that's where, for example, in emergent strategies, you might find a company being very proactive, being very aggressive in terms of its pricing, its marketing, its advertising for, let's say, a 3-month period, and then consolidate that position because of the change in, for example, economic conditions, become a bit more defensive perhaps, cut a bit back on costs and marketing budget and so forth. So those would be your emergent theories. Finally, a word on leadership in terms of corporate strategy or competitive strategy or strategic management. I mentioned before that the board and the senior execs are, in the final analysis, responsible for strategic direction, also responsible for the measurement and the change of that strategy. Part of that in the environment at this point is also for them to ensure that the triple bottom line are being achieved and adhered to. So we spoke about the financial one, but there's also the corporate social responsibility, which has become part of competitive strategy, where I think there are two bases that we need to look at. The one is from a value-based perspective, that the company does contribute toward corporate social responsibility, as well as, of course, the third one, which is the environment, gas emissions and so forth, making sure that those are within prescript. But there's also the second part of strategy, of course, that plays a role with those two areas of the triple bottom line, and that is also for the organization to ensure competitive sustainability, because nowadays in those two areas, heavy regulation, heavy penalties do play a role. So the company is well advised from a strategic point of view to also look after those two parts of the triple bottom line. That'll conclude this introduction section of competitive strategy. In our next section, we will have a look at the basis from which we start driving and developing a strategy, which will include vision, mission, and objectives. Thank you very much.